In the beginning, no one believed it was possible. The idea seemed too exaggerated, almost offensive, that ordinary people with no history of violence could be convinced to commit a crime solely through psychological influence, not out of hatred, not for money, not due to a direct threat, simply for the sake of obeying. Most people reacted the same way when they heard the hypothesis. That wouldn't work on me. And it was exactly this certainty that made the experiment so dangerous. It all began as a seemingly harmless academic study. Advertisements were published inviting volunteers to participate in research on human behavior and decision-making. No mention of violence, no mention of crime, just science, just collaboration. The participants were ordinary people: teachers, students, office workers, fathers and mothers. People who, outside of that setting, considered themselves ethical and responsible. People who considered themselves incapable of deliberately hurting another person. They entered the building calmly. They signed forms. They received clear explanations. The environment was clean, organized, and professional. Everything conveyed safety. Everything seemed legitimate. And this wasn't just a detail. It was the foundation of everything. The lead researcher presented himself with a firm posture, a calm voice, and natural authority. He wore a lab coat. He spoke with confidence. He didn't seem like someone doing something wrong. On the contrary, he seemed like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. In the beginning, the tasks were simple: answering questions, pressing buttons, making small decisions with no apparent consequence, nothing that caused real discomfort, nothing that raised suspicion. Each completed step reinforced a silent feeling: I am helping. But gradually something changed. The instructions began to demand more involvement, more responsibility, more active participation. Always gradually, always small enough not to provoke an immediate refusal, always large enough to push an internal limit. No participant realized exactly when they crossed the line, because there was no clear line. There was only a sequence of small concessions. And the most disturbing part, at no point was anyone forced. They continued, because they believed they had to continue. What no one there knew was that the experiment wasn't testing decisions. It was testing how far an ordinary person would go before questioning their own conscience. And the next step would change everything. In the second phase of the experiment, nothing really seemed different. The participants were still sitting in the same room. The researcher remained calm, polite, and technical. There were no shouts, no explicit tension, just instructions. But the content of those instructions began to change. Now, each participant believed they were interacting with another person, another volunteer, according to the researcher. This person needed to answer simple questions. The participant's task was simply to apply small penalties when the answer was wrong. At first, the penalties were symbolic, a slight discomfort, something almost irrelevant. The researcher reinforced that there was no real risk, that everything was under control, that this procedure was common in behavioral studies. And once again, no one questioned it. The logic was simple. If someone in authority says it's safe, then it must be. Furthermore, everyone had already agreed to participate. They had already given consent. They were already too involved to simply get up and leave. With every mistake made by the other volunteer, the penalty had to be increased. One level above the previous one, always a bit more intense, always announced as necessary for the progress of the study. Some participants began to hesitate. They asked if it was really necessary. The researcher responded with neutral, almost automatic phrases. The experiment requires that you continue. It is important for the validity of the data. You are not responsible for the effects. These phrases had a curious effect. They didn't pressure. They relieved. They shifted responsibility. They removed the moral weight of the individual decision. Little by little, something dangerous was happening inside the participants' minds. They stopped thinking, I am doing this, and started thinking, this is being done through me. When the other volunteer began to show discomfort, groans, complaints, pleas to stop, some participants laughed nervously. Others fell silent. Others asked for guidance. Almost all of them continued. Not because they liked what they were doing, but because stopping now would mean admitting that everything up to that point had been wrong, and that was too hard to accept. The experiment didn't advance by force, it advanced by moral inertia. Each new stage made the previous one less serious. After all, if you've already done that, why stop now? And it was at this point that the participants crossed the first real limit. Without realizing it, without deciding consciously, without imagining how far it would take them, the next stage wouldn't just bring discomfort. It would bring something much harder to justify. In the third phase, the experiment stopped being just uncomfortable. Now it began to touch something deeper, the notion of right and wrong. The other volunteer was no longer just complaining. He was showing pain. He was asking to stop. He was questioning why this was happening. At times, he screamed. The sound pierced the wall and filled the room with a tension that was hard to ignore. Participants reacted in different ways. Some sweated. Others looked away. Some laughed nervously. But almost all did the same thing in the end. They followed the instruction. When someone hesitated for a longer time, the researcher would approach calmly and repeat, with the same neutral voice, "It is essential that you continue. There is no permanent damage. The experiment depends on it." There was no threat. There was no punishment. Just an authority saying that it needed to happen. At this point, many participants already realized they were crossing a line. Some clearly said that it felt wrong, that they didn't feel well, that they wanted to stop. But the answer was always the same. The study requires that you continue. And then came the decisive moment. To stop would mean assuming something painful, that they had hurt someone unnecessarily. Continuing, paradoxically, seemed easier. Continuing allowed them to believe that all of this had a greater purpose. Scientific, rational, justifiable. That's how something disturbing happened. People began to obey not despite the guilt but to escape it. The further they advanced, the harder it became to turn back. Each new action mentally rewrote the previous one. What once seemed unacceptable now seemed just part of the process. Some participants asked if the other person was okay. The researcher replied that he had agreed to the study, that everything was under control, that any discomfort was temporary. And that word made all the difference. Because if suffering is temporary, then maybe it isn't really a crime. Maybe it's just a side effect. At this point, many no longer saw the person on the other side as someone real. They became an element of the experiment, a data point, a variable, and that made everything easier. But the experiment had not yet reached its most disturbing point, because in the next stage, the participants would be led to believe they had caused something irreparable. In the fourth phase, the experiment entered irreversible territory. Now it was no longer just about discomfort or momentary pain. The participants came to believe that their actions could be causing serious and permanent damage. The other volunteer began to beg. He said he had health problems. He said he couldn't take it anymore. At one point, he stated he didn't want to participate anymore. Shortly after, silence. No answer. No sound. The room became heavy. Some participants looked at the researcher expecting him to stop everything. But he remained calm, observing, taking notes, as if the silence were just another piece of data. When someone asked if the other person was conscious, the answer came quick and cold. A lack of response must be treated as an incorrect answer. It was a technical phrase, inhuman, and for that very reason, powerful. Some participants refused at that moment. They stood up. They said they would not continue. But they were the minority. The majority remained seated, staring at the panel in front of them, trying to justify what they were about to do. The researcher didn't pressure them emotionally. He simply reminded them, "You agreed to participate. You are responsible for completing the task." Stopping now compromises the entire experiment. These words created a mental trap. Not continuing meant failing. It meant wasting everything that had already been done. It meant admitting that their own previous obedience had been wrong. So many continued, with trembling hands, with failing voices. But they continued. At this point, The idea of crime was no longer abstract. Some participants verbalized exactly that. They said it seemed illegal, that it seemed too wrong to be just a study. The researcher responded with the same calmness as always. I assume all responsibility. And that phrase changed everything, because if someone assumes responsibility, then maybe you are not to blame. Maybe you are just following orders. Maybe the moral decision is no longer yours. It was at that moment that something fundamental broke. Individual conscience was replaced by obedience to the system. Personal judgment was handed over to authority. And the most disturbing part, no one was being deceived by force. They knew it felt wrong. Even so, they continued. Because now, stopping didn't just mean protecting the other person. It meant facing themselves. And few were prepared for that. The experiment was about to reveal how far this logic could go. In the fifth phase, the experiment had already surpassed any comfort zone. The participants believed at that moment that the other volunteer could be gravely injured, or worse. Even so, the researcher did not end the study. On the contrary, he acted as if everything were occurring as expected. The silence from the other side of the wall became deafening. Some participants repeatedly asked if anyone was monitoring the person's condition. The researcher replied that it wasn't necessary, that the protocol was being followed, that interruptions would only occur if they were truly indispensable. This ambiguity kept everyone trapped in the situation. At this point, something extremely dangerous psychologically was happening. The participants began to emotionally distance themselves from what they were doing. They spoke less. They breathed more mechanically. They carried out the orders almost automatically. It wasn't coldness, it was self-protection. To think too much would mean entering into conflict. So, many simply stopped thinking. They obeyed. They pressed buttons. They announced penalties. They fulfilled the role assigned to them. Some even verbalized phrases like, "I'm only doing what I was told. This is no longer under my control." These phrases weren't excuses for the researcher. They were excuses for themselves. The experiment revealed something unsettling. When responsibility is diluted, morality is too. The more distant a person feels from the final consequence, the easier it becomes to continue. At this stage, participants no longer asked if it was right. They only asked what the next step was. Obedience had replaced judgment. And then came an even more disturbing detail. Some participants began to show clear signs of extreme stress. Tremors, excessive sweating, difficulty speaking. Even so, they continued. Not because they were insensitive, but because stopping seemed to require more courage than moving forward. The experiment wasn't proving that people like to hurt others. It was proving that the right structure can make the unthinkable executable. And the scariest part? Most of the participants went much further than they themselves believed possible. But the study wasn't over yet, because the next phase would bring something impossible to ignore. The revelation that, at that point, they believed they had committed something that no scientific justification could erase. In the sixth phase, the experiment reached a critical psychological point. The participants were no longer just obeying. Now, many believed the worst had already been done, and this belief completely changed how they viewed their own actions. The silence from the other side of the wall continued. No answer. No sound. For several participants, that meant only one thing. Something serious had happened, perhaps irreversible. At that moment, the researcher did something decisive. He neither confirmed nor denied anything. He just kept giving instructions, as if it were an irrelevant detail, as if the fate of the other volunteer was already sealed. And this ambiguity was devastating. When someone asked if the person was alive, the answer came back cold, technical, impersonal. The experiment requires that you proceed. For many, this phrase was interpreted as a silent confirmation that stopping now would change nothing. If something bad had already happened, then interrupting the study would bring no relief. It would only bring guilt. That's how the logic reversed. Continuing began to seem less painful than stopping. Obeying seemed less cruel than assuming responsibility. The participants began to act as if they were trapped in an inevitable sequence. Each new instruction was followed with fewer questions. Obedience no longer came from trust in authority, but from the feeling that there was no longer a clean moral way out. Some murmured to themselves. Others avoided looking at the panel. Some closed their eyes for moments before moving forward. But the majority followed through. The experiment showed something profoundly disturbing. When a person believes they have already crossed an irreversible limit, they become capable of going even further, not out of malice but out of psychological despair. At this stage, no one there felt like a villain. They felt trapped, and the researcher knew it. He no longer needed to convince them. He no longer needed to justify. The participants' own minds did the work. The idea that it's already too late functioned like an invisible prison. It was at this point that the data began to get truly terrifying. Because the absolute majority of the participants continued to obey, even believing they might be causing something close to a serious crime. And the experiment was about to reveal how far this logic could go when taken to the extreme. In the 7th phase, the experiment no longer depended on the researcher's authority. Obedience had become internal, automatic. The participants no longer waited for long explanations. They just heard the instruction and executed it. At this point, many no longer saw themselves as moral agents. They saw themselves as parts of a larger mechanism, something that was in motion long before they entered the room, something that would continue to exist even if they refused. This perception was false, but powerful. The researcher realized he no longer needed to insist. When someone showed hesitation, a look, a brief pause, or a short phrase was enough. "Continue, please." And they continued. What's most disturbing is that at this stage, some participants began to justify their actions spontaneously. Not to the researcher, to themselves. They said things like, "If it weren't me, it would be someone else. This was already decided. It's not me doing this." These phrases revealed something deep, the complete transfer of moral responsibility. The act was still executed by the participants' hands, but the decision was no longer perceived as theirs. That was where the idea of crime became distorted. It no longer seemed like a crime committed by someone. It seemed like an inevitable event, conducted by an impersonal system. Some participants began to show signs of emotional detachment. Their voices became neutral, their faces immobile, the tone almost bureaucratic, as if they were filling out a form and not making potentially destructive decisions. Others reacted in the opposite way. They became excessively nervous, talked too much, laughed for no reason. But the result was the same. They continued. At this point, the experiment had already proved something terrifying. You don't need to convince someone that a crime is right. You just need to convince them that it's no longer a choice. As the study approached its end, the participants believed they had taken part in something irreparable, something that would stay with them forever. And then, when the tension was at its limit, the researcher did something unexpected. He stopped everything. But the revelation that followed did not bring immediate relief. It brought something much harder to deal with. The mirror. In the 8th phase, the experiment was abruptly interrupted. The researcher turned off the equipment and asked the participants to step away. He announced that the study was over. There was no celebration. There was no immediate relief, only confusion. It was then that the revelation came. The other volunteer had never been hurt. He was never in danger. He never suffered real harm. The screams, the pleas to stop, the silence, it had all been staged. Part of the experiment. A carefully planned script to provoke exactly those reactions. When they heard this, some exhaled. Others were in shock. Some cried, not out of fear, but out of shame, because the experiment hadn't tested violence. It had tested obedience. Many participants didn't celebrate the fact that no one had been hurt. They were too busy facing a much more difficult question. How far did I go? Realizing they had obeyed orders they believed were potentially criminal, Many entered into intense conflict. Some said they never imagined they would act that way. Others wondered if they really knew themselves. The researcher explained calmly that this reaction was common, that the goal of the study was precisely to demonstrate how context, authority, and gradual progression can lead ordinary people to cross moral boundaries without realizing it. But no scientific explanation seemed sufficient at that moment. The psychological damage was already done, not because someone had been hurt, but because they were confronted with themselves. They hadn't committed a real crime, but they had come close enough to feel the weight, and that would change the way they viewed authority, orders, and decisions forever. But the impact of this experiment wouldn't end there, because when its results went public, the world reacted in a way no one expected. When the results of the experiment were analyzed, even the researchers themselves felt uncomfortable. The numbers left no room for doubt. They had been confronted with a version of themselves they preferred not to know. Some asked if their data would be released, if their names would be associated with the experiment. The fear now was no longer about having hurt someone. It was about being seen as people capable of doing that. The researcher guaranteed anonymity. He guaranteed that everything would be used only for academic purposes. Even so, many left the room in silence, avoiding eye contact. The majority of participants had gone much further than they believed themselves capable of. Not because of moral deviance, but because of structured obedience. The data showed a clear pattern. The more legitimate the authority seemed, the further people went. Lab coats, technical language, institutional environment. Small details that, together, created enough of a sense of security to suspend individual moral judgment. When the results began to circulate, the reaction was intense. Some scientists were fascinated. Others were horrified. The question stopped being, did the experiment work, and became, should it have been done? Ethical critiques quickly emerged. Experts argued that the psychological suffering caused to the participants had crossed any acceptable limit, that leading them to believe they had committed something close to a crime was a grave violation. Universities began to review protocols. Ethics committees were strengthened. Similar studies began to be banned or severely limited, not because they were useless, but because they worked too well. The experiment had revealed something society wasn't ready to face, that the line between an ordinary citizen and a criminal can be much thinner than we like to admit, that in specific contexts, normal people can act in frighteningly predictable ways. This led to inevitable comparisons with real historical events. Mass crimes, orders followed without question, entire systems functioning based on blind obedience. The experiment didn't explain everything, but it explained enough. And gradually, a conclusion began to form among experts. The real danger isn't in violent individuals, but in systems that encourage ordinary people not to think. But one last question remained. Perhaps the most uncomfortable of all. What does this say about you? After the experiment was concluded, the participants returned to their apparently normal lives, jobs, families, routines. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, almost everything was different. Many reported that they began questioning orders more frequently. Others said they started to distrust excessively formal environments and people who spoke with too much authority. Some avoided any situation involving rigid hierarchy. The experiment didn't turn them into criminals, but it destroyed a dangerous illusion, the idea that a clear line exists between me and someone capable of committing a crime. This line is not fixed. It moves according to the context. Authority, social pressure, diluted responsibility, gradual progression. When these elements combine, individual moral judgment can be replaced by obedience. That's why this story is so bothersome. Not because it reveals hidden monsters, but because it shows ordinary people making choices they never imagined they would make. The experiment proved something we prefer to ignore. It's not necessary to convince someone that a crime is good. You just need to convince them that they are not responsible. You just need to create an environment where questioning feels wrong, where obeying feels safe, where stopping feels too late. And this doesn't just happen in laboratories, it happens in companies, in institutions, in governments, in groups that hide behind rules, positions, and protocols. The question that remains isn't whether the experiment was cruel, it's whether it was too honest. Because if placed in the same circumstances, with the same pressure, with the same authority in front of you, how far would you go before saying no? Perhaps you believe you would stop early. Most believed that. And that is the most disturbing part of all. After all this, perhaps the most difficult question isn't about the experiment. It's about you. Because this story isn't about bad people. It's about ordinary people, placed in the right context, following orders, trusting authority, believing they weren't responsible. The experiment ended, but the logic behind it continues to happen every day, in places far from laboratories. The line between right and wrong rarely disappears all at once. It moves, slowly, silently. And by the time we realize it, we've already gone too far. If this video made you reflect, question, or feel uncomfortable, then it has fulfilled its role. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Leave your like. It helps the content reach more people. And share this video with someone who believes they would never be influenced to go that far. Because understanding these stories isn't about judging the past. It's about seeing the present, and mainly, about recognizing how much more influenceable we are than we like to admit. Until the next video.